Welcome to Brainthropology. Let's talk about our amazing brain and the issues that get us stuck. We all have those moments where life gets overwhelming. It can be related to injury or illness, or an issue with your kids, or just because life is crazy and we need a little help and encouragement. Our team of therapists, expert guests, and clients are here to deep dive into the topics that matter most. We will share information with our listeners that encourages, educates, and empowers.
This episode is brought to you by Galaxy Brain and Therapy Center, helping clients live their best lives by implementing strategies such as those discussed in this podcast. Galaxy Brain and Therapy Center is located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, serving southeastern Michigan for in-person and community-based services. Out-of-state virtual and teletherapy services available for OT, PT, speech, mental health, and mindfulness. Check out their website at galaxybraincenter.com.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Brainthropology podcast. We are here with Jessica Smith and Debbie Loftus and myself, Meg Scaling, and we are going to do a part 2 series, piggybacking off of what we talked about last week, which was parts of the brain, the left brain and the right brain, and how the different hemispheres do amazing things. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, you're going to want to tune back in and play it back and listen to that. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach and talk a little bit more about the nervous system, because the brain is a part of your central nervous system, but it's just one part. And in order for us to get better at things, we also rely very heavily on our spinal cord and the nerves connected to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about these other factors that affect our ability to overcome illness and injury and developmental milestones. And so I don't want to get too far in this podcast, but I do want to bring up a personal and professional positive. So my positive today is my dog, Gracie. She is the sweetest ever, and I swore I would not get a dog because I didn't need one more thing to take care of. And everyone thought that they couldn't believe I didn't have a dog, and now I do, and I can't believe I didn't have a dog for all those years because she's amazing. Debbie, what's your positive?
Today, my positive is my children. I have a 16-year-old boy, Connor, and an 18-year-old girl, Chloe, and they are two of my wonderful, joyful additions to my family, and my husband, Steve. But honestly, my family, in the last couple of weeks, we've got to spend a lot of time together, and they are my joy. So that's my positive.
Jessica, what's your positive today?
Mine is not as deep. Mine is prepared food. Like, I sometimes just get home from work and am like just not ready to cook. And we have been getting like these healthy, it's called Clean Eats. They're healthy meals and they're prepared. And my best friend told me about them and I love them. So I guess time, it gives me time, right? So time's my positive because not cooking dinner and just having those gives me more time with my family. So that's my positive.
I love that. Well, I think sharing a fun fact about the brain and the nervous system is also kind of a fun way to start the podcast. One thing that I thought was fascinating in some of our research that we've been doing is that we didn't talk a lot about blood flow to the brain. It's very important. It could be its own podcast of the cerebral spinal fluid and the fluid that goes around the brain and innervates the brain. But it is fascinating that the blood vessels that are present in the brain are almost 100,000 miles in length. Wow. 100,000 miles in length.
That's incredible.
That is just unbelievable. So I thought that was something fun to share. The other thing that I think is important for us to talk about is not just the brain, even though we love the brain, but the spinal column, because the spinal column is so important to getting information from the brain down to the other parts of the body and back. The spinal column is I think of it like a racetrack. Like, it is how information just zooms from one part of our body to another. And it's so important. It is so important that we have a spine to protect it. Mm-hmm. you think about where that spinal column is located in our body. I mean, I'm sure there are acrobats that can twist and turn all different ways. Jessica, you're a gymnast. You're a gymnast. Did you actually have back problems from the way you would make your spine move?
I didn't. I had friends that did, definitely, but I didn't. So I just had a flexible spine, I guess.
Yeah, some people do. But we have vertebrae that protect our spine, and we really can only move certain directions for a reason, because that spine is so important to us. And inside that spine, there is that smooth center that protects the spinal cord. And so if you think about an extension cord that has all those wires running through it, and then there's that plastic covering on the outside, and then picture it kind of locked inside a box. Like the spine really is protected, and our nerves are so protected because they are so important. So it really is something that's worth protecting for multiple reasons. And if the spine is severed, then function is lost in so many ways. So the reason why our spine is so important is because the nerves that start in our brain move down the spinal column and are carried out through the transverse process of the vertebrae into our limbs and our arms and our legs and different parts of our organs. And it's so important for that spine to stay protected. Now, we all know someone who has had a spinal cord injury. Can you think of someone off the top of your head?
I mean, the first person that I think people think of is Christopher Reeves. I mean, the public figure, such a terrible accident. And we've seen him recover. And he's the first one that comes to mind for me.
That is a great example. I think everyone knows that sad story. There's another thing called myelination that is really important to talk about when we talk about the spinal cord. Jessica, can you expand on that for me?
Yeah, so sometimes we have complete severs of the spinal cord, and that's where we see the injuries that we commonly see as spinal cord injuries, and that's where Christopher Reeves comes in. And sometimes, like multiple sclerosis, where there's just pieces of that spinal column and spinal cord that are missing something. And what they're missing is the myelin sheath. And that's just a fancy word for lubrication, right? It's lubrication of the spine, the spinal column, and it makes all of our messages that we need to send down that spinal cord travel really, really quickly, like quicker than we can even think about. And so those messages travel down the spinal cord, and the lubrication comes from a process called myelination. And sometimes those myelin sheaths are missing, and those diseases present functional deficits. It might be someone has a hard time walking. So if you're trying to picture myelination, Meg, you had a really good example that you talked about, candy necklace. I know we were like, what? How does a candy necklace relate? But do you want to kind of give that visual of myelination?
Yeah, I was just, as we were talking about it, I was thinking about those candy necklaces or those noodle necklaces that your kids make when they're little. And when the necklace is full of all those noodles, picture like that being the fast track. Like information travels really great. But when some of those noodles break, then there are issues. It's glitchy and information doesn't travel as fast.
Yeah. Great example. Good visual, I feel like. So our spinal cord is also responsible for reflexes. And sometimes things need to get done quickly, basically to save our life or to save our hand from being burned on a stove. So when you think about reflexes, those all are because of our spinal cord. I could go on and on about reflexes. It's my passion. I do a lot of reflex integration work, and we're going to have a whole podcast on that later. But just for today, let's talk quickly about the importance of reflexes, because those really do come back to that spinal cord. So when you think of something that has to happen super quickly, and I'm going to go back to that example of I'm talking to someone and I accidentally, in our new house, we now have an electric stove, and I've never had an electric stove, and I will be converting it soon. But for now, we have an electric stove, and so the tops get really hot. Well, all the time I'll like set stuff on there, I'll put my hand on there. So if you think I put my hand on the hot electric stove and all of a sudden it's burning, if I had to think about pulling, like, oh, this is hot, I need to pull my hand off, that process would take so long, my skin would be really burned, right? So instead, we have these built-in reflexes. And so I set my hand on the stove, automatically my hand just pulls back because it feels that heat. Those messages get sent to my spinal cord and then right back to my hand. They don't have to travel all the way up to my brain. So my sensory receptors on my hand feel it, sends a quick message to the spinal cord. Spinal cord can interpret it and then send a motor response back to my hand to pull my hand off. And all of that is thanks to our spinal cord. So we, again, protecting our spinal cord is super important, and reflexes kind of can originate there. So
I love that visual, because it reminds me of my son, who we also have an electric stove, who will sometimes just like tap it just to see how fast he can tap it. And he won't feel the burn because he taps it so fast he doesn't feel the burn.
Yeah.
And if we waited, then there would be an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So reflexes, they're beautiful. I love them.
So I think about reflexes too, and the reflexes are really there to protect us, which is why that spinal cord is so protected also, because our reflexes protect us. I know when I did pediatrics, you're always trying to get those protective extension reflexes working. So for kids, sometimes you'd sit them down on a ball and you tilt them one way, and you want that opposite, you want their opposite arm out. You want them to be balancing. You want them to be able to keep their head righting. You want them to be able to, if they're going to fall, have that protective extension where their arms automatically come out and they don't have to think about that. And that's for protecting the head, protecting the brain, protecting that part of our body. I also think about, like, if you were to stand up, and if our listeners were to stand up and just lean forward, mm-hmm. and notice what happens to your toes. Do your toes go up, or do they claw to the floor? They claw to the floor.
They dig in.
Yep. What's that reflex called?
Foot tendon guard.
That's right.
So it helps us with our balance. We don't have to think about it, right? You didn't think, oh, my foot should grip the floor. It just happened. That's the beauty of reflexes. We want them just to happen to protect us.
And you don't even realize it sometimes if you're at the gym or you're doing something, you're not injured, and they say, okay, go on one foot and do a quad stretch. And all of a sudden you're on one foot and your toes are clawing into the ground and you have that stability. It's such an important reflex, whether it's functioning or not, it really has implications in daily life.
Absolutely. We appreciate them more than we know. And because how many reflexes do we actually have approximately?
I don't even know. Like, the amount is in the reason the number is kind of insane is because we're actually born with some, and then we quote unquote lose them, right? And it's not that we lose it, but it becomes integrated. And so then we kind of gain new reflexes as we mature. And so our reflexes are constantly changing. And there's some reflexes that last a lifetime, they're lifelong reflexes, and some are primitive reflexes. So we are born with them and we want to see them in a newborn, ages 0 to 2 months or 4 months, and then we don't want to see them, right? They should function in the background. And sometimes when an injury happens, they come to the foreground and we start seeing these reflexes emerge, and they actually do more harm than good. So we have to talk to the reflexes and say, hey, we want you, we appreciate you, we just need you to run in the background for us. So the number, I don't know, there's a ton a ton.
Yeah. We took a class and learned about 22 of them, and I thought I was going to die. It was so much information, and there's so many more to learn. Yeah. I think one of the fascinating things that I think about in the reflexes and think about that developmental is that the Atr reflex, a lot of us, if you were to look at baby pictures of your kids or baby pictures online, just look at an infant age 0 to 3. And what are they going to look like? They are going to have one arm flexed, one arm out, and they're going to be looking towards that straight arm, right? And then if their head turns the other way, they're going to look like this. And they do this. It's like a corkscrew effect that when their head turns, their arm moves. And when their arm moves, their head moves. And when you think about that developmentally in the womb, what's that doing? What's that, Jessica? What do you think that's developing?
Our brain, right? We're learning both sides. We're learning our right side, and that's developing the left side of our brain. And then our body's learning how to move our left side of our body, developing our right side of our brain. So it helps with that whole brain development. It also helps the birthing process. So it helps baby come out.
Yeah, it's like a corkscrew effect.
Yep.
But then when we celebrate when the baby has found their mouth, right? When they can bring their hands to their mouth and we're like, oh my gosh, they found their thumb. What we're doing is celebrating the integration of that because that no longer is helpful. We want that baby to self-soothe. We want that baby to find their mouth. And that means that reflex is not working anymore. And this gets me back to crossing midline, right? Because when there's an injury and reflexes reappear, because Atr reflex does reappear often.
Yes.
That Atr reflex, it's asymmetric tonic neck reflex, right? Yeah. Okay, so when that does reappear, it needs to be reintegrated. And so what are some of the things that we do to reintegrate that reflex when that shows up again?
For crossing midline?
Sure. That helps to integrate it, correct?
Yeah. And we do a lot of even passive integration. So in some of the work I do, it's actually turning the head and then, kind of stretching that arm out and teaching the body and the brain like, hey, this is helpful, but every time you turn your head, your arm doesn't have to pop right out. And we see this like if kids are crawling and they like turn and look, if one arm just totally bends when they turn their head and look, that may mean issues with their Atr reflex. And why that's an issue at that point is because we don't want that automaticity. If they're crawling, they need to have, support through both arms. And if they turn their head and collapse, that could be an injury, right? So we want them to be able to isolate head movement and not have to have that automaticity of one arm going straight and one arm bending. It's helpful that age 0 to 2 months, 3 months, because they can, it helps them integrate their audio processing, their visual when their head turns and their arm kind of goes out. They're looking down their arm. They're developing that auditory processing, that visualization. But eventually we want it to, integrate in.
Yeah. And the spinal reflexes, talking about the spine, you want those to develop so that we can have automatic gait. So we don't have to think about walking.
Yeah.
So all of those things, this is kind of a little tickler for another podcast and another day, because reflexes are something we will go into in the future because they are just fascinating. But the spinal cord is amazing on so many levels. So tell me, I think it's worth talking about a little bit about maybe the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system and our nerves, because there are nerves that run from your brain down your spinal column all the way into your limbs. There are sensory nerves, there are motor nerves, and it's really important to know that the nerves, when you hear of a peripheral nerve injury, that means that injury happened outside of the brain and outside of the spinal cord. So can you give me examples of peripheral nerve injuries?
Yeah. So sometimes people say, oh, my hand's tingly, right? Carpal tunnel sometimes it's, people who type and kind of get that pinching in their wrist. Carpal tunnel can affect their hands. That's a peripheral nerve injury. Someone who has diabetes and they say, oh my gosh, my legs are tingly. Peripheral nerves, that's what we're talking about. They don't have an issue in their spinal cord, but it's those nerves like directly, in their legs or their arms. So that's what we mean when we talk about peripheral.
And I think too, a lot of repetitive stress injuries.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we see that work hardening programs, that's what they're designed for. Those a lot of times are peripheral nerve injuries. And we treat those as well.
I think about chainsaw injuries, right? Like when you have, or car accidents where you have a nerve severed. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with the brain or the spinal cord. It's that nerve is severed in your limb. Yeah. And so often they try and reattach the nerves as fast as they can, but to try and get that nerve function back if ever they can. But what happens when there's a peripheral nerve injury and is it possible to get that hand back working again when you have a peripheral injury out here? Is there actual regeneration that's possible?
Good question, Meg. Yes, nerves do regrow. Peripheral nerves regenerate at about 1 inch per month. So if you think of that, let's just for visualization say the injury happened at the elbow, right? If you had to approximate, that's probably about 1 foot to 1.5 foot down to our fingertips. So that's over a year, right, to regenerate all of that nerve. So 1 inch per month kind of seems fast, but really in reality, it's pretty slow. Now, I will say we have to use it or lose it, right? So we have to be moving. We have to draw attention. The nerves need to be talked to. And so massaging that area, kind of talking to your nervous system, movement can grow nerves, right? Movement is super important for nerve growth. So that's definitely a possibility. It takes rehab, right?
It does. And, even visualization. Have you ever had clients visualize
Absolutely
their hand working and doing things, and maybe even having both hands help?
Yeah.
Sometimes when your left hand isn't doing the task as well, your right hand can be doing it. And if you can model what you want your left hand to do with your right hand.
We have mirror neurons. So that's a topic for a whole nother day. And mirror neurons are fascinating. We can even have some listeners do some things with mirror neurons, but you're talking about mirror neurons, right? So that visualization, watching someone else do it, someone else do the movement kind of stimulates some of that communication with those nerves too. Let's talk about nerves in a not so technical way, right? So when you think of nerves, what do you think of? Like if we're not talking nerves in a technical manner and
I'm thinking of a party. I'm thinking of the best social party ever where they don't want to be alone. They like to recruit their friends. Like when I think about a nerve, I think about a beautiful person with a big afro that has all these like extensions, and they just look fabulous, and everyone wants to be next to them. And the hair is just reaching out like the dendrites, and it's grabbing everyone around it. And she's just like the center of the party. And then I think about everyone dancing together, and she says, hey, I'm going to teach you a dance, and everyone's going to dance, and you're going to be my friend, and you're going to come along. And before you know it, it's like a flash mob, and she is the center of the flash mob. But then before you know it, you can't even find her, because she was the life of the party, and she was the center of the universe. And then all of a sudden, all these other nerves came along, and you can't find her in the flash mob because everyone is helping, and they're all joining in together, and they're all doing their job. And it's like everyone's working together. And I think of nerves as being like a party.
That's awesome. I love that analogy.
Is that right or left brain?
That is my left. I think in pictures. So when I think about things, I think in pictures, and that is what I picture. I just picture this amazing party that I want to be at.
Well, it's an appropriate analogy because nerves are very social. They talk to other nerves, and you could say they get together and work together, so they make the job easier. So it was a perfect visualization.
Yeah, and a formal word is like recruitment. Am I right? Like they recruit other nerves to help them.
Yeah.
And so peripheral nerves, while they grow, so they can grow and they can recruit other nerves around them to help them get the job done as well. In the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, those nerves don't regenerate as well. They really don't have that same regeneration factor. So recruitment is so essential when the injury happens in the brain.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we need to reteach areas and rely more on those peripheral nerves and kind of expand all of that. So
another fun fact is that going back to myelination is that it starts from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, which makes sense why our frontal brain develops last. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about some of these issues that come up when nerves are damaged. What that looks like. What does that look like when someone has a spinal cord injury and the spinal cord is damaged? What does that functionally look like for some individuals?
Yeah, so it depends on where the injury is, right? So if it's a higher level injury, you see more function lost. If it's a lower down the spine, so towards their lower back or even mid back. So if you can kind of picture the whole spinal cord, if the injury is up at the neck level, that's when you see someone who can't really use their arms. And it also depends on how the injury is. So if it's a complete sever, then they're not able to use their arms at all. You can see them using a sip and puff wheelchair because they have oral motor function. If they have an incomplete sever of that spinal cord, then they may have some arm use. So it just depends on where that level of injury is and what their function looks like.
Yeah. Can you, Deb, maybe give an example of someone who worked on a goal and got better and maybe what their injury looked like?
Yeah. And this isn't only for spinal cord injury. I mean, sometimes any kind of brain injury mimics some of the symptoms that we see. A very common symptom we see is spasticity. So when you see somebody with their hand that is pulled back in a fist. So when someone can't move their arm because the part of the brain that controls motor movement is damaged, but the part of the brain that protects the body is working, then we see the arm pull back as a reflex. But the problem is there's no motor movement. The motor pathway isn't working to move itself back and relax. So it stays in this fixed fist position. And we see that flexor pattern. And that really can be a problem with self-care and function. Because if we think about how we're doing our daily tasks when we, take a shower, when we brush our teeth, that really can get in the way when you're trying to brush your teeth, when you're trying to brush your hair. So as far as a therapeutic program, how we address this, many times we try to reduce that spasticity to get more normal movement. Some of the techniques we use, they're not always active. So sometimes it's a passive movement where we're gently doing stretching exercises to normalize that pathway in the brain and causing a relaxing movement to allow people to have a more normalized sensation in their arm and try to reprogram that pathway in the brain. So
it's so interesting. So I just think the listeners, this is it's a good thing to review. So when, like we talked about, you touch something hot and you pull back. So that spine is touching something hot and pulling back. And when I see this in clients, it's not because of something hot. It sometimes is because like they sneeze or they have a bodily function that's like achoo, and then they pull back, or it's
they laugh.
Yeah. Right? Like sometimes it's those kind of movements or those kind of just like spontaneous reactions that cause that to flex up. But then the problem is, like you said, is they don't have the motor control, that part of the brain that says, okay, we can relax now. You can extend your muscles. You can extend your arm out. And so they're stuck in this until someone straightens it for them.
And then the next step after that's retrained is try to get some of the movement back in active movement. So many times we start with passive, and we actually can train somebody to use their non-affected hand to do it themselves in a safe way.
Yeah, and then you're recruiting all those nerve friends, that party in the brain. You're recruiting the nerve friends around that area to take over and help straighten that arm back out again.
Absolutely.
You have a client that was in this situation.
Absolutely.
That started one way, and tell us his journey.
Yeah, pretty phenomenal. When I started working with him, he really had little to no use of his right upper extremity. He presented in that, flexor pattern. So the elbow is flexed, the wrist is up to your chest. It almost looks like somebody's going to punch you, but they don't have the active movement to do that. And it's very frustrating. And we started working on it, and probably, 3 to 6 months worked on passive exercises and a lot of family retraining as well, for passive range of motion, a home exercise program. And then after a certain period of time, that pathway learned some relaxation movement, and they were able to extend their elbow. And once that occurred, we were able to use meaningful activities to start retraining some of the motor pathways. So, for example, this client was really interested in video games before his accident. He was really interested in basketball. And so, although we couldn't go outside and use a real basketball hoop at this stage of the game, we had little soft pom-poms that we had the little basketball hoops that you put on the edge of the door. And, his mom, who was an amazing caregiver, would hold the basketball hoop, and I would facilitate his elbow, and he would be able to open and close his arm. Really encouraging only his affected side to use it, because your brain wants to do the route of least resistance. So of course, if his right arm was affected, he would immediately use his left arm and pick those up and try to put those in the hoop. So sometimes it takes more than one therapist. Sometimes it takes a co-treat to do this. But, in the matter of, I would say probably 3 to 6 months, we had a lot of active movement. And what's interesting is, Jessica, I know you love your reflexes, is after that period of time, I accidentally dropped one of the palms, and his right hand initiated to pick it up. And his mom and I looked at each other and we started crying. We're like, oh my gosh, he didn't even know what he did. But it's amazing how your brain works, that once you start retraining that pathway over time and time and time again, just like a baby has to learn those muscles, those patterns over and over before they crawl, before they stand, before they walk. Very similar when you're retraining the nervous system with a, right upper extremity deficit, or, any for that matter. We did the same thing with his leg in using a meaningful activity of soccer. And that is a whole podcast in itself, because when you use meaningful activity to get the brain involved, there are so many research studies that show that outcomes are so much more significant and quicker. And also being in your natural environment. So this particular client was a soccer player. And so we went to the soccer fields, and the outcome that we had, instead of just being in his home, it was double fold. So
I bet he loved that too.
It was amazing.
It's probably a session he'll always cherish.
Yeah, and I have it on video. So like I said, tidbit for therapists, always try to record as much as you can so you can see the outcome. Because when you see somebody every day, whether it's a caregiver or a family member, they don't notice the progress. And when you show them a video 3 months apart, it really is beneficial.
Yeah.
I also want to highlight, I know all of us have this story. We have had so many clients come to us and say, oh, my doctor said after 6 months, I can't gain anything back, or 2 years, insert whatever number you want. But we've had so many clients come to us and say that, like, well, why am I here at rehab? Like, my injury was 2.5 years ago, and my doctor said I won't gain anything after the first 12 months. We just talked about nerve regrowth and 1 inch a month. We have potential. Our brain has so much redundancy built in, and so much ability and extra space that we can use, right? So we just have to keep trying. And I just want to highlight, like, your client that you just discussed, Debbie, how long ago was the injury?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think 4 or 5 years post.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I worked with someone 9 years after her injury, and she made such significant gains. No one could believe it, but she had never tried it before.
So therapists, people with injuries, don't let anyone tell you after X amount of time, you're done. It's not true.
That's true.
So we've talked a lot about clients that have had injuries to the brain and spinal cord injuries. We really haven't covered a lot of clients who have demyelination issues, MS, ALS, any of that. And I just want you to know that we'll touch base in the future. We'll get there, and we're here for you. So if you have questions, we'll be doing something in the future with that as well. And we'll touch on that.
That's great. We have spent a lot of time talking about the spinal cord and the nerves, and I really appreciate the input you both give, and I think our listeners appreciate it as well. In the first podcast of this series, we talked about left and right brain, and in a future podcast, we're actually going to really do a deep dive into the different lobes of the brain and what those different lobes do. And that will be another fun topic where we can talk a little bit more about our amazing brain.
as always, thanks for joining us, and we encourage you to be courageous and move forward in your day with hope, joy, and purpose.
While we love what we do and are as passionate as they come, the information on this podcast and discussion is for educational purposes only and should not replace professional medical advice. Please consult your own healthcare provider if you are seeking medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment for you or anyone else. We do our very best to provide correct information, but please understand science and medicine is ever changing. We welcome feedback, comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. This disclaimer applies to any guest or contributors to the podcast or blog.